Monster is a series that understands something most stories about evil struggle with. Evil is not loud, it is not theatrical, and is rarely obvious in the moment it appears. Instead, Monster treats evil as something quiet, something patient, something that grows through absence rather than spectacle, and to understand that, the series doesn't just rely on its main plot. It repeatedly returns to a children's fairy tale about a monster with no name, a story told in fragments, a story that shifts slightly every time it is heard, a story that begins simple and slowly becomes something harder to define. At the center of Monster is one of the most compelling psychological relationships in anime, the dynamic between Dr. Kenzo and Johan. But running parallel to that is something quieter, something symbolic, something almost mythic in structure. The fairy tale of the nameless monster. In this story, a nameless monster travels the world desperately wanting a name. Because the world is so large, the monster splits into two to search for one. Traveling east, the monster encounters villagers, a blacksmith, a shoemaker, and a hunter. It offers them strength in exchange for their name. Once the monster enters and possesses them, it grows so large that it consumes them from the inside out, turning them back into a nameless monster. It is told like a bedtime story, but it behaves like a warning, because over time, it begins to blur with reality. Johann Liebert begins to resemble the monster in the tale, not because he announces himself as such, but because the world around him starts to describe him in the same language. He appears in people's lives, destabilizes them, and then disappears without leaving a clear trace of intention. What remains is not explanation, but aftermath. Just like in the fairy tale, the question becomes less about what happened and more about what is he supposed to be called. This is where Monster becomes more than a psychological thriller. It becomes a study of how stories form around fear. Johan is chaotic. He's not emotionally volatile. He is calm, precise, and almost absent in the way he moves through the world. His impact is defined not by presence, but by residue. Fear, fragmentation, and the quiet unraveling of identity in those he touches. He does not behave like a monster in the traditional sense. It behaves like something that only becomes real once it is named. And in contrast, Dr. Tenma represents the opposite force. Not simply good, but responsibility made human. Tenma saves a life at the beginning of the story, choosing principle over institutional expectation, and that single decision becomes the anchor for everything that follows. His journey is not about defeating evil in a direct sense. It's about carrying the weight of consequence through a world that refuses to provide clarity. The relationship between Tenma and Johan is not a conventional hero and villain structure. It is a connection built on action and aftermath, on intention and interpretation, on a man trying to preserve life, and something that seems to erase meaning wherever it goes. And the fairy tale, The Monster, mirrors this dynamic, because every time it is told, it changes. Details shift, emphasis shifts, meaning shifts. It stops behaving like a fixed story, and starts behaving like memory, unstable, interpretive, and shaped by fear. In that sense, the fairy tale is not just a motif, it is the narrative DNA of the entire series. Because Monster constantly asks whether evil is something that exists independently or something that is constructed through repetition, testimony, and the need to explain what cannot be understood. The series' slow pacing reinforces this idea. It is deliberate, patient, and often uncomfortable, but that structure mirrors how influence spreads over time, how moral consequences accumulate, and how a single decision can echo far beyond its origin. Every subplot, every character, every seemingly isolated event eventually folds back into the same question. What creates a monster? Is it origin? Is it circumstance? Or is it the moment the story becomes certain enough to be believed? Because in Monster, the most unsettling truth is not that the monster exists. It is that they might only exist because people need them to. And that is what it takes to be great.